Garrett McKinley spotted the old man from 100 yards away, sitting motionless by the creek that cleaved through his property. The Apache's weathered hands rested on a gnarled mesquite staff, his silver hair catching the sun like spun moonlight. He looked ancient, a sentinel against the backdrop of ancient cottonwoods. Garrett's jaw tightened as he spurred his horse forward. This was his land, carved from hardship and sacrifice, bought and paid for by generations of McKinleys. He'd weathered droughts and blizzards to build this ranch from nothing, and he wasn't about to let some stranger claim squatters' rights, no matter how old they were. The closer he rode, the colder his anger became. The old man remained unmoved, seemingly oblivious to his approach, as if he were a part of the very landscape, as if the land itself whispered secrets only he could understand. Garrett dismounted 20 feet away, his boots landing heavily on the dry earth. The Apache finally raised his head, revealing eyes that held the panorama of decades, mirroring sun-baked mesas and star-filled nights. But Garrett saw only a challenge. "You're trespassing, old man," Garrett said, his voice ringing through the afternoon air. "This is private property. No one is allowed to come without my permission." The Apache's expression remained unchanged, a monument of stoicism. He simply inclined his head toward the creek where clear water cascaded over glistening stones. "Water is the blood of the land," Joseph Red Hawk said, his English carefully chosen, resonant with a deep understanding of nature. "I drink from the earth as do the deer and the eagle. I meant no harm." "I don't care what you meant," Garrett snapped, his patience fraying. "You can't just wander onto people's land because you're thirsty. There's a town 5 miles east with a well, or ask the landowner if you want to have a drink." He thought about the stories he'd absorbed growing up. Whispers of conflict, tales of hardship and unspoken grievances. This old man might appear harmless, but Garrett knew the whispers of history. Distrust was a weed that grew easily in this land. "I will leave this place," Joseph said, his voice steady, struggling to rise with the aid of his staff. His body wavered with the effort, and for a moment, it seemed he might collapse under the weight of years. Garrett watched the ancient figure struggle, an internal battle raging within him. A part of him knew he should offer help, but generations of ingrained prejudice held him captive. To offer kindness might be perceived as weakness, an invitation to intrude. "Make it quick," Garrett said, crossing his arms, "and don't return here again." But as Joseph Red Hawk took his first uncertain step away from the creek, fate intervened. The old man's walking stick struck a hidden stone, sending him sprawling forward, a gasp escaping his lips as his body met the unforgiving ground. Garrett stared down at the fallen Apache, wrestling with conflicting impulses. The cold voice of pragmatism told him to allow the old man to depart, to erase his presence from the land. But another voice, a quiet echo of his mother's teachings, reminded him of the inherent dignity of every human being. That hesitation, that moment of moral reckoning, would alter the course of his life. Because 30 miles away, Thomas Red Hawk had already noticed his father's absence. And when Thomas Red Hawk went searching for his missing father, he moved with the force of a summer storm. Garrett stood rooted to the spot as Joseph Red Hawk lay still on the ground, a crimson trickle staining the parched earth near his temple. The old man's breaths were shallow, his eyes closed, and for a heart-stopping moment, Garrett feared the worst. His mind conjured a landscape of potential consequences. A dead Apache on his land would unleash a torrent of trouble. The authorities would demand answers he was unwilling to provide. Worse, if the old man had family searching for him, they would inevitably follow his trail. "Hey," Garrett called out, his voice rough with forced indifference. "Old man, you all right?" Joseph's eyes fluttered open, clouded with confusion. He attempted to sit up, wincing, his hand clutching his ribs, the sight of a sharp pain. Garrett found himself edging closer against every instinct that screamed at him to retreat. The logical action would be to remove the Apache from his land as quickly as possible, before witnesses arrived. But the old man was clearly unable to move, perhaps seriously injured. "Can you get up?" Garrett asked, his reluctance palpable. Joseph struggled, his face contorted in pain. When he spoke, his voice was a faint rasp. "My ribs," he whispered. "Broken, I think." Garrett cursed silently. This was the turning point. The moment where a simple trespass could spiral into an all-consuming disaster. He couldn't abandon an injured old man to die, but he couldn't afford the ramifications of providing assistance. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of approaching riders. The last thing he needed was to be discovered standing over an injured Apache with no justification to what had happened. "Look," Garrett said, kneeling reluctantly. "I didn't push you. You fell on your own. Do you understand? I am only here to help you." Joseph Red Hawk studied Garrett's face, his eyes conveying a complex narrative. "I know," Joseph said softly. "You helped me to shade. Now I need to rest for a while." Every instinct within Garrett recoiled at the idea. His father had warned him repeatedly about interacting with indigenous people, about how a gesture of kindness could be seen as a weakness to exploit. But observing this injured old man, isolated and vulnerable, Garrett couldn't bring himself to leave him there. He helped Joseph struggle to his feet, supporting the weight of the frail Apache as they made their way to the shelter of a towering cottonwood. The old man was lighter than anticipated, his body fragile beneath Garrett's touch. "Water," Joseph whispered once they reached the tree. Garrett retrieved his canteen and watched as the Apache drank slowly, deliberately. Close up he could discern the intricate artistry of the old man's attire. Beaded patterns adorned his worn leather vest, a testament to the artistry of his people. His braided hair was interwoven with beads and feathers, carrying a legacy of tradition and resilience. This was no savage nomad. This was a carrier of culture, a repository of ancestral wisdom. "What is your name?" Garrett heard himself asking. "Joseph Red Hawk," came the soft reply, "and you are Garrett McKinley. This is my home." Joseph nodded slowly. "Good land, strong water. My ancestors walked here long ago." The words resonated within Garrett, striking a chord. This was more than a simple trespass. It was a connection to the past, an echo of a history predating property deeds and territorial boundaries. But before he could fully process the implication, Joseph Red Hawk spoke a warning that sent a shiver down his spine. "My son will be searching for me. He is protective." "Your son?" Garrett's voice was a mere whisper. "Thomas Red Hawk. He is a leader among our people. He is a strong and noble warrior. He worries when I am away from home." Joseph's eyes met Garrett's, devoid of threat, filled with a profound awareness. "He will come looking when the sun is getting down." The name Thomas Red Hawk struck Garrett like a physical blow. Every rancher in the territory knew that name. The Apache leader who commanded respect from his own people and the territorial government. The man who negotiated peace treaties, a man who was known for keeping his word and protecting the land of his ancestors. And Garrett was sitting next to his injured father. "Thomas Red Hawk is your son?" Garrett's voice cracked, despite his attempt to remain calm. Joseph nodded, wincing as he shifted against the tree trunk. "He is a good son, loyal. When the sun fades and I do not return home," he gestured weakly toward the horizon, "he will ride." Garrett's mind raced, recalling every story he'd heard about Thomas Red Hawk. The man was more than a tribal leader. He was a mythic figure. Tales were told of him tracking down rustlers who stole Apache horses, restoring them unharmed but shaken. How he arranged for the release of settlers without bloodshed. He commanded loyalty from the Apache warriors who would follow him anywhere. "How long before he starts looking?" Garrett asked, already dreading the answer. Joseph studied the sun's position through the cottonwood leaves. "Soon. Very soon." Panic surged through Garrett. Discovering an injured Apache elder on his land was a terrible situation, but having Thomas Red Hawk discover his father wounded on a white man's land, that could mean destruction, or at the very least, the end of everything Garrett had worked to build. "I need to get you back to your people," Garrett said, rising quickly, "before there are more problems." But when Joseph attempted to rise, he cried out, falling back against the tree. The fall had caused more damage than either of them had realized. His face was pale, and sweat dotted his brow despite the cool shade. "Cannot ride," Joseph gasped. "Ribs, perhaps lung." Garrett stared at the injured man, his desperation growing. He couldn't move Joseph without the risk of serious harm, but he couldn't leave him here. And with each minute that passed, the chance of Thomas Red Hawk's arrival increased. That's when he heard it, the sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. Distant yet distinct, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a rapid pace. Too many horses for casual travel, too disciplined for random riders. Joseph heard it as well. His eyes met Garrett's, conveying something akin to understanding. "They come," Joseph whispered. Garrett grabbed his rifle, his hands shaking as he checked the chamber. 6 bullets against an unknown number of approaching riders. The odds were not in his favor, but he wouldn't surrender without a fight. The sound grew louder, closer. Garrett could now discern individual hoofbeats, sense the precise nature of their formation. These were not just searchers. This was a war party moving with a single purpose, and leading them would be Thomas Redhawk, coming to reclaim his lost father. In the distance, dust clouds swirled, rising against the afternoon sky. Garrett had perhaps 2 minutes before they crested the ridge and saw him standing over their injured elder with a rifle. 2 minutes to conceive how to resolve the unresolvable. The thunder of hoofbeats reached a crescendo as 8 Apache warriors crested the ridge, their figures etched against the setting sun. At their lead rode a man who commanded attention by his sheer presence, Thomas Redhawk, his powerful body and presence creating fear in all those he rode against. Garrett's finger tightened on the trigger as the war party approached, but Joseph Redhawk's hand clamped onto his wrist with surprising strength. "No," the old man whispered, his voice urgent. "If you aim that weapon at my son, no words can save you." The riders slowed as they reached the creek, their horses snorting, kicking, pawing at the ground. Thomas Redhawk dismounted swiftly, his eyes landing immediately on his father beneath the cottonwood tree. What Garrett saw in those eyes was more than rage. It was a controlled force, a tempered intensity. Thomas was younger than Garrett had imagined, perhaps 40, with long black hair and lines across his eyes. He wore traditional clothing mixed with Western riding gear and a knife that looked like it could skin a bear in seconds. "Father," Thomas said in Apache, his voice a knife. Joseph responded in the same language, gesturing toward Garrett. The dialogue was quick, but Garrett sensed Joseph's goal: to soothe, to explain. Joseph was trying to diffuse the situation before it escalated. Thomas's eyes shifted to Garrett, observing him like a predator studies its prey. When he finally spoke, his English was perfect. "You are on your land," Thomas stated, not asked. "Yes, sir," Garrett replied, hating the tremor in his voice. "This is my property, and my father was trespassing." Again, a statement, not a question. Garrett nodded, unsure where this was headed. Thomas took a step closer, and Garrett resisted the urge to lift his rifle. The other warriors remained on their horses, alert, their hands near their weapons. "Tell me what happened," Thomas commanded. Garrett found himself reciting the events, the discovery, the accidental fall. Throughout his story, Thomas's expression was unreadable, but Garrett felt the weight of his judgment. "You gave my father water," Thomas observed when Garrett finished. "He was hurt and needed it, but first I asked him to leave." The accusation hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder. Garrett felt his blood rising. "He was trespassing. I had a right to tell him to leave." "You had a right," Thomas said, his voice dangerously soft. "Just as I have rights." The threat was palpable. Garrett glanced at the mounted warriors, calculating. If this became a battle, he wouldn't last long. But then Joseph Redhawk spoke in Apache, his voice stronger than before. Thomas listened. When his father finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "My father says you helped him when you could have left," Thomas finally said. "He says you brought him water and provided shade when he needed it, when you had no reason to help him." Garrett wasn't sure what that meant. "He also says," Thomas continued, "that you were scared." The words hit home. Garrett had been terrified from the moment he realized who Joseph was, and that fear had grown with each passing second. "Wouldn't you be?" Garrett asked, surprised by his own honesty. For the first time, something resembling respect flickered in Thomas's eyes. "Yes," he admitted, "I would be." The moment stretched between them, 2 men from different worlds trying to comprehend each other. Finally, Thomas went to his father, kneeling. "Can you ride?" he asked Joseph. Joseph shook his head. "Ribs broken." Thomas's jaw tightened as he examined his father's wounds. When he looked at Garrett, his face had hardened. "My father cannot be moved safely. He requires medical care." Thomas stood, his height dominating. He will stay here. Garrett's hope vanished. Having an injured Apache elder on his land was his worst nightmare. For how long? He asked. Thomas Redhawk's smile was like ice. As long as necessary. The sun continued to drop in the sky as Thomas Redhawk's words hit home. Having Joseph stay on his property could take weeks. Garrett's mind raced, imagining the consequences. The questions, investigations, and the effect it would have on him. "Wait," Garrett began, but Thomas stopped him with a look. "My father was hurt on your land," Thomas said, his voice firm. "You are responsible." "He fell." "Yes," Thomas agreed, "and yet we are here." The logic was sound, and Garrett knew he couldn't win. Thomas Redhawk hadn't become a leader by backing down. "I have a ranch to run," Garrett tried. "I can't." "You will have help," Thomas said. "Help?" "2 of my warriors will stay. They will also assist with your cattle." Garrett looked at the Apache warriors. "People will ask questions. They will think you are doing what is needed, which you are." Before Garrett could speak, Joseph Redhawk spoke, his voice carrying. He said something in Apache that made Thomas change. "My father reminds me that you could have left him to die, and you offered him water." He studied Garrett. "He believes there is honor in you." "I'm not afraid," Garrett lied. Thomas's smile cut. "Yes, you are, and that is wise. It keeps you alive." The conversation was stopped by Joseph. Thomas went to his father, listening to him. Whatever Joseph was saying made Thomas concerned. When Joseph finished, Thomas remained there for a moment, his hand on his father's shoulder. The compassion reminded Garrett that he was a son concerned about his father. "What did he say?" Garrett asked. Thomas stood, never leaving his father's face. "He says the pain is worse. He thinks he is bleeding." Thomas was more urgent. "My father needs medicine, or he may not survive." Garrett felt the world turning. A dying Apache elder would have consequences he couldn't imagine. The nearest doctor was miles away, and Joseph couldn't travel. "The doctor won't come for him," Garrett said. Thomas locked eyes with him, and Garrett saw a test. "Then you will have to get him to do it," Thomas said. "Because if my father dies here, you will have to pay." Garrett was stuck in an impossible situation. Risk everything to save him or watch Joseph die and deal with the consequences? You are Garrett. What do you do? If you were Garrett, what would you do? Risk your reputation and safety to ride into town and demand a racist doctor treat an Apache elder? Or stay and hope Joseph survives without medical help, knowing that failure means facing Thomas Redhawk's justice? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Garrett decided next would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Garrett stared into Thomas Redhawk's unwavering eyes and made a decision that surprised even himself. Without another word, he strode to his horse and swung into the saddle. "I'll get the doctor," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Dr. Morrison will not come willingly. He has strong feelings about my people." "Then I'll have to change his mind." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement of Garrett's resolve. "Take Swift Arrow with you," he said, gesturing to one of his warriors. "If Morrison refuses to come, perhaps seeing one of us will clarify his obligations." The warrior Thomas indicated was young, maybe 25, with intelligent eyes and traditional Apache war paint still visible on his cheekbones. He dismounted smoothly and approached Garrett's horse. "That might make things worse," Garrett said, though he wasn't sure why he was trying to protect a doctor he'd never liked. "Or it might make them honest," Thomas replied. "Swift Arrow speaks English well. He will know if Morrison lies to you." There was no more time to argue. Joseph's breathing had become labored, and a grayish pallor was creeping across his weathered features. Every minute counted now. Garrett and Swift Arrow rode hard toward town, the Apache warrior keeping pace effortlessly despite riding bareback. The landscape blurred past them as they pushed their horses to the limit, neither man speaking, but both understanding the stakes. Town appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent toward evening. Garrett had made this ride countless times, but never with an Apache warrior beside him, and never with a man's life hanging in the balance. They thundered down the main street, drawing stares and whispered conversations from the town's people. Garrett ignored them all, focusing only on the white clapboard building that served as both Dr. Morrison's office and residence. He dismounted and burst through the doctor's door without knocking, Swift Arrow close behind him. Dr. Morrison looked up from his desk, his face immediately darkening when he saw the Apache warrior. "McKinley, what in God's name?" "I need you to come to my ranch," Garrett interrupted. "There's a man dying." Morrison's eyes flicked to Swift Arrow again. "What kind of man?" "The kind that bleeds red like the rest of us," Garrett snapped. "Are you a doctor or not?" "I don't treat Indians," Morrison said flatly. "You know that." Swift Arrow stepped forward, his presence filling the small office. When he spoke, his English was precise, educated. "The man dying is Joseph Redhawk, respected elder of our people. His son Thomas Redhawk leads warriors who have never forgotten an insult." The threat was clear, and Morrison's face went pale. Everyone in the territory knew that Thomas Redhawk's word was law among the Apache, and his protection extended to all who earned his respect. "You're threatening me," Morrison whispered. "I'm explaining consequences," Swift Arrow replied calmly. Garrett found himself caught between two worlds, two sets of laws that rarely intersected peacefully. But looking at Dr. Morrison's fearful face, he realized that fear might be the only language that worked here. "Doc," Garrett said quietly, "Joseph Redhawk is dying on my property. If he dies, Thomas Redhawk will hold me responsible. And if he holds me responsible..." Garrett let his own implications hang in the air. Morrison understood. If anything happened to Garrett, the doctor would be the only witness to this conversation, the only one who could have saved Joseph's life but chose not to. "I'll need my medical bag," Morrison said finally, his voice resigned. "Already in your buggy," Swift Arrow said with the faintest smile. Morrison stared at the warrior in shock. "How did you?" "We have been watching you since we arrived," Swift Arrow explained. "Thomas Redhawk does not leave important matters to chance." As they prepared to leave, Garrett realized that everything he thought he knew about this situation had been wrong. This wasn't a random encounter or a simple trespassing dispute. The Apache had been planning, watching, preparing for multiple outcomes. But the question that gnawed at him as they raced back toward his ranch was simple. If they had been watching Dr. Morrison, what else had they been watching? And what did Thomas Redhawk really want from all of this? The ride back to Garrett's ranch felt like the longest 15 miles of his life. Dr. Morrison sat rigid in his buggy, clearly terrified, but trying to maintain professional dignity. Swift Arrow rode alongside them, his presence a constant reminder of the stakes involved. When they arrived at the creek, the scene had changed dramatically. The Apache warriors had built a small shelter using branches and Garrett's own saddle blankets, creating shade and privacy for their injured elder. Thomas Redhawk knelt beside his father, speaking softly in Apache while monitoring his breathing. Dr. Morrison approached reluctantly, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. Up close, Joseph's condition was clearly serious. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor and his breathing was shallow and irregular. "I'll need to examine him," Morrison said quietly. Thomas nodded and spoke to his father in Apache. Joseph's eyes opened, focusing on the white doctor with a mixture of resignation and dignity. "He gives permission," Thomas translated. What followed was the most tense medical examination Garrett had ever witnessed. Morrison worked efficiently but carefully, his hands gentle despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. The Apache warriors watched every movement, their faces impassive, but their attention absolute. "2 broken ribs," Morrison announced after several minutes. "One has punctured the lung partially, internal bleeding, but not severe enough to be immediately fatal." He looked up at Thomas. "He needs rest, pain medication, and careful monitoring, but he should recover." Relief flooded Thomas's face, the first genuine emotion Garrett had seen from the Apache leader. "How long?" 2 weeks minimum before he can travel safely. A month would be better." Thomas nodded, then turned to Garrett. "You heard the doctor. My father will remain here during his recovery." Morrison packed his instruments quickly, clearly eager to leave. "I'll need to check on him in 3 days," he said. "And if his condition worsens, you will come immediately," Swift Arrow finished. "This we understand." After Morrison left, an awkward silence settled over the group. Garrett found himself alone with 8 Apache warriors on his property, responsible for the health and safety of their most respected elder. "Your warriors," Garrett began carefully. "They can't all stay here. People will—" "Only 2 will remain," Thomas said. "Swift Arrow and Running Bear will tend to my father and assist with your ranch work. The others will return to our people." "And you?" Thomas's smile was enigmatic. "I will come and go as needed. My father's recovery is my responsibility." As the sun began to set, the other warriors prepared to leave. Garrett watched them mount their horses with fluid grace, their departure as organized and disciplined as their arrival had been. Before leaving, Thomas approached Garrett one final time. "You surprised me today," he said quietly. "How so?" "You could have let fear control you, could have chosen your comfort over my father's life, but you did what was right, even when it was difficult." Garrett felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You did what a man of honor would do. There is a difference." As Thomas mounted his horse to leave with the main group, he called back over his shoulder, "Swift Arrow and Running Bear will earn their keep. They are skilled hunters and know cattle better than you might expect." "Wait," Garrett called out. "How do they know cattle?" Thomas's laughter carried across the evening air. "Where do you think we learn to raise horses, McKinley? We have been watching your people's methods for decades, learning what works and what fails." The realization hit Garrett like a thunderbolt. The Apache hadn't been raiding cattle, they had been studying ranching techniques. Everything he thought he knew about the relationship between his people and theirs was based on assumptions and prejudices. As the war party disappeared into the gathering darkness, Garrett found himself alone with Swift Arrow, Running Bear, and the injured Joseph Redhawk. The old man was resting comfortably now, the doctor's pain medication helping him sleep peacefully. "This is going to be interesting," Garrett muttered to himself. Swift Arrow overheard and smiled. "More interesting than you know, McKinley. My grandfather once told me that the best lessons come from the most unexpected teachers." "What's that supposed to mean?" But Swift Arrow had already turned his attention to building up the fire, leaving Garrett to wonder what other surprises this unlikely partnership would bring. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a troubling question began to form. If the Apache knew so much about cattle ranching, what else did they know about his life that he had never suspected? 3 weeks later, Joseph Redhawk was strong enough to sit up and share meals around the fire that had become the center of an unlikely community. What had started as a forced arrangement had evolved into something none of them had expected. A working partnership that benefited everyone involved. Swift Arrow had proven to be an exceptional tracker, locating 6 head of cattle that had wandered into a canyon Garrett hadn't even known existed on his own property. Running Bear possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather changes, saving the ranch from 2 potentially devastating storms by moving livestock to higher ground just in time. But it was Joseph himself who provided the most surprising revelation. "Your grandfather," the old Apache said to Garrett one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, "he was a good man." Garrett nearly choked on his coffee. "You knew my grandfather?" Joseph nodded slowly. "During the drought of 1862, when the creek ran dry, he allowed our people to water their horses here, asked for nothing in return, said water belonged to all living things." The words echoed Joseph's first statement when Garrett had found him by the creek. And suddenly everything clicked into place. This hadn't been random trespassing. It had been a pilgrimage, a return to a place of kindness. "My father never told me that story," Garrett said quietly. "Your father was young then, frightened by the stories others told about us." "But your grandfather," Joseph smiled at the memory. "He judged men by their actions, not their blood." Thomas Redhawk chose that moment to emerge from the growing darkness, having arrived for his nightly check on his father's progress. He'd been coming every evening for 3 weeks, and Garrett had begun to look forward to these visits. "How are you feeling, Father?" Thomas asked in English, a courtesy he'd adopted since learning that Garrett was trying to pick up a few Apache words. "Strong enough to ride home," Joseph replied, "but not eager to leave such good company." Thomas studied the camp, the shared fire, the easy camaraderie between Swift Arrow and Garrett as they planned tomorrow's cattle drive. Running Bear teaching Garrett how to read cloud formations. What he saw seemed to satisfy him. Perhaps, Thomas said carefully, it is time to discuss the future. Garrett felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this conversation was coming, but he'd been dreading it. The arrangement couldn't last forever, and when it ended, he'd likely return to the isolation and prejudice that had defined his life before. What kind of future? Garrett asked. Thomas sat down across from him, his expression serious. My people have been watching the territorial government's plans for this region. There will be changes coming. Railroad expansion, mining operations, new settlements, changes that will affect all of us. What does that have to do with me? Survival, Thomas said simply. The old ways of thinking, the old divisions between our peoples, they will not serve us in what is coming. We need allies who understand that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict. Swift Arrow looked up from the map he and Garrett had been studying. Thomas is offering you a partnership, McKinley, a real one. What kind of partnership? Garrett asked, though part of him already knew. Your land borders our winter grazing territory, Thomas explained. Your cattle could benefit from access to better grass during the dry months. Our horses could benefit from your breeding knowledge, and both our peoples could benefit from presenting a united front when the railroad men and government officials arrive. It was a generous offer, more generous than Garrett had any right to expect, but he could see the wisdom in it. Isolated ranchers would be easy targets for exploitation, while those with powerful allies would be respected and protected. People in town won't like it, Garrett said honestly. People in town will adapt, Thomas replied with quiet confidence. Or they will find themselves left behind while others prosper. Joseph Redhawk struggled to his feet, his recovery nearly complete. My grandfather used to say that a man's character is revealed not by how he treats his friends, but by how he treats those who are different from him. He looked directly at Garrett. You have shown your character these past weeks. The weight of the moment settled over them all. Garrett realized he was being offered something rare, a chance to be part of something larger than himself, something that could change the future of the territory. If we do this, Garrett said slowly, we do it right. Equal partners, shared decisions, mutual respect. Thomas Redhawk extended his hand, and when Garrett shook it, he felt the strength and calluses of a man who worked as hard as any rancher. Equal partners, Thomas agreed. As they sat around the fire that night, planning their shared future under a canopy of stars, Garrett reflected on how much his life had changed since that afternoon by the creek. He'd started the day as an isolated rancher, suspicious of anyone different from himself. He was ending it as part of a family he'd never expected to find. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of night birds calling to each other across the darkness reminded him that the best things in life often came from the most unlikely encounters. Sometimes what appears to be a simple confrontation between strangers becomes the beginning of something that changes everything. For a cowboy who learned that true strength comes from opening your heart, even when fear tells you to close it. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel now. Click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, where courage and compassion collide with destiny in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the American frontier. Click on the video. So, what began as a tense standoff fueled by prejudice and misunderstanding blossomed into a beautiful testament to the power of compassion and respect. Garrett's willingness to help a stranger, despite his ingrained fears, opened the door to an unexpected friendship and a partnership that promised a brighter future for both his people and the Apache. It's a reminder that sometimes, the greatest rewards come from taking a chance on kindness, even when it's the hardest thing to do. What did you think of Garrett's choice? How would you have reacted in his situation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What resonated with you most about this story? Do you have any questions about the characters or the historical context? Let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier and want to hear more stories filled with courage, compassion, and unexpected twists, be sure to subscribe. That way you won't miss any of our future videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.